Okay, so I think I'm gonna answer a few questions. So, Master Beekeeper, whoever this is, if I freeze my honey frames right after taking them out of the hive, can I safely store the honey in the frames until next year? Seems the danger of pests in the honey would be overcome through freezing the honey for 24 hours or so. So, do you mean just kind of storing them? Yeah, I suppose over a entire season. Yeah, you can definitely do that. Yeah, because if you store at room temperature, for example, or in a shed, you risk small hive beetle or any diseases or even wax moth. And so you can store those frames in a freezer if you have room. And so that's definitely a good method. And I'm not sure if Heather put questions in the Q&A. Okay. Yeah, if you have any other questions, please let me know.
Dr. Slater, this is Doug
Yes.
Wingate. Um, I have had issues with like honey absorbing water, like in a honey dipper jar or one of those hive. Um, it looks like a little beehive honey storage unit for the kitchen table, and it just will swell with water. I have noticed. What I will occasionally do is put it in my dehydrator and keep it at a low temp, but let it dehydrate for a couple hours. Um, I'm not going over probably about 105, and it seems to dry the honey out for a little bit so that I could use that. Um, you don't think that it's affecting any of its natural enzymes, do you?
No, I don't think so. Because I never thought about using just a home dehydrator. I think it's a great idea. Or if you have like a jerky dehydrator, yeah, I mean that works really well. I mean, I don't see any issues. I don't think the temperature gets that high either, right? Like what temperature do they use or you
Well,
use?
you can. It's fully adjustable, right? You can
Yeah.
dehydrate at 95 degrees. You can dehydrate at 156. Um, and it's big enough that you could put some of the bigger canning jars in as a whole unit. And I was just wondering the surface area at the top of an open mason jar, would you have to, I guess, compensate longer to get the moisture of the total jar down to a certain level?
Yeah. Are you sort of a standard mason jar? Pretty
Yeah.
standard size.
So,
Yeah.
yes.
I think you probably have to mix it maybe a couple hours here or there just because you're probably getting the moisture on the top of the jar and the honey on the top of the jar, but probably not on the bottom. So you may want to mix that every so often. It'd be curious to see how well that works. Maybe if you have do you have a refractometer?
No, I don't. I need to get one.
I'd like to test that. Yeah. So let me know how that goes. But I think that could be a really great effective way. You just might have to mix the honey a little bit more to get the honey from the bottom because the honey from the bottom might have a higher moisture content too. So,
Okay. So
but
that the moisture's not going to, um, I guess, naturally move through the jar of honey. You think it's
it
going to?
it will. It will. It just depends how long you do it for. So I mean, if you're doing it for, I guess I'm not sure how long, 24 to 48 hours, it might remove most of it. I'm seeing like, sort of like a barrel. So you have a full barrel that has 55 gallons. You might have to mix that up a little bit more, but maybe a mason jar wouldn't. If you do it for long
Okay.
enough. I just don't know how long that would be.
Maybe I'll do that as a project for my master's level
Oh, that'd be great.
master beekeeper. Right? How many hours do you need to keep a jar of honey in a dehydrator?
Yeah, and you said you're using what 110, 120?
Um, I have used a 110 and left it in there for almost all day, like 5 hours.
Okay.
So,
Yeah. If you like refractometer, let me know how well that works. I think that's a really practical method for a lot of small scale beekeepers, and I think a lot of them probably have access to
okay,
it dehydrated like that. So I never thought about that, but I think that makes sense.
okay, thanks.
So Dan says, do you have to treat comb honey for small hive beetles? Yeah. So I mean, if you're freezing it, you should be fine. But if you're just storing, if you're just storing your honey supers in just a shed, for example, for multiple days to a week, the small hive beetle can move in and cause some issues. I don't think there's a good way to treat or manage that. I mean, if you plan on keeping it for a long period of time, I would just keep it on the colony. So either extract it as soon as possible, or keep it on the colony, or even freeze it. Oh yeah, so Master Beaker said, could you repeat your answer to the freezing honey for later use? Yeah, you can definitely freeze your honey. And so by freezing the honey, you don't have to have any issue with small hive beetle. You can put it in the colony later in the spring. And so yeah, freezing is a really great option. And Dustin says I do that. I store honey frames to make my splits. The following year, just have to make sure I have plenty of time to thaw. Yeah, D Dustin, how long do you let them thaw for? Maybe 24 hours, I'd imagine would be more than enough to let them thaw.
Yeah, that's plenty of time. You just don't want to put the cold frames into a
Yeah.
small split.
Yep, that makes sense. So Disa said, are you storing it in the freezer or freezing for 24 hours and then storing them in a tight container? I'd imagine you storing it for until you put it back in the colony because I guess I wouldn't freeze it for 24 hours and then store it in a room temperature or in a shed, for example, because the small hive beetle can move in once it dethaws. So, I'd store it indefinitely until you plan on putting into, yeah, like a nook, for example, or your split. Oh, Lynn posted a really great picture. Yeah, yeah, this is a really great idea. So you put this right on top of a 5-gallon bucket. So you go to the chat. Lynn has a really great method for dehydrating her honey. And Lynn, do you mix your honey at all, or does this do a really good job of dehydrating it? And how long do you do this method for?
Well, I haven't used that exact method. I use mine by, if I possible, while they're still in the frame, but I'll put them in boxes and then just run a fan over them in a room with the dehydrator. So, like in a closet or like having a spare bathroom, I'll do them in there. But if it's already in the bucket, I usually just run a dehydrator and then just stir it every 2 or 3 times a day, and that works. I'll put like a cheesecloth over the top of the bucket because you're just dehydrating the surface area of the honey,
Sure.
so you have to stir it.
Yeah. So what's your typical water content down in Fort Bend? Like, do you guys? I'd imagine it's pretty high in your area of Texas.
Yeah, some years it's been and around 19 or so, and I really like mine to be just under 18 because as it's stored, it's gonna absorb more moisture from the humidity.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I love all these different ideas. So that's what I love about this program is kind of sharing what beekeepers are using because there's really not a right or wrong way of doing it. There's different ways to lower the moisture content if you do have issues. Okay, perfect. I'm gonna jump into the selling honey in Texas. And Lynn's on the call, so if I make any mistakes, I know you're heavily involved with this. I'm still kind of learning the laws and regulations of Texas, but I think we are able to make a really great fact sheet and information for beekeepers across Texas. So there's probably some things you guys may have questions about. So these are things I can look up and look more into. But I think I try to cover as many bases as possible. But there's something else you want us to look more into, like maybe you have a specific situation or scenario. I can help you get some answers and see whether that's legal or not to sell in the state of Texas or even across the border. Okay, so first I always talk about this is just how much honey is produced in the state of Texas. So I think we kind of lose sight on just how important really the state of Texas is for the beekeeping industry. And so whether you're a small scale beekeeper, whether you're a commercial beekeeper, Texas is, one of the major epicenters of beekeeping in Texas. And so one of my major focuses, and we'll talk more about this next week during the queen breeding and rearing section, Texas produces about 30 to 40% of the queens in the entire nation. And so they're really important for queen production, nuke production, and colony production for beekeepers across the country. But Texas is also home to a lot of the major honey producing colonies in the country. And so this is the USDA NAS survey. Now, I will say surveys are always a little problematic. They're always kind of under survey beekeepers. So just take these results with a grain of salt because they're surveying mostly the commercial beekeepers. So beekeepers that have above 10 colonies, but probably more beekeepers that have above 500 colonies. So I would love to survey more beekeepers across Texas, just sort of have a more accurate number. But from this 2022 census survey, they found that Texas was home to 157,000 honey producing colonies, which is up about 25,000 from 2016. So I'm guessing the number is probably closer to 200,000 right around now. And we'll probably get those new results here pretty shortly. But remember, North Dakota was the number one honey producer, but a lot of the North Dakota beekeepers come to Texas, so it's really hard to separate the Texas beekeepers from the North Dakota beekeepers because a lot of them do come to Texas. But one thing this isn't considering is a lot of the small scale beekeepers. And so if we add the small scale beekeepers that are producing honey, whether for their personal use or whether they're, selling it wholesale, locally or even across the state, this number probably at least doubles, triples, even maybe quadruples, who knows? But yeah, we look at the honey price. The honey price was ranked 20th across all 50 states. Now you're probably wondering like why is this honey price so low? I mean, really the major reason is they're looking at commercial beekeepers are selling their honey in bulk, and so if you're selling your honey in barrels or yeah, really larger barrels or in bulk, your honey price is going to be a little bit lower. So that's one reason the honey price is so low. And so we have states such as I think Virginia was number one. They had the highest honey price around I think 10 or $12, $10 or $12 I think a pound. But they also don't have the number of commercial beekeepers that are dragging this number down. So I think in 2022 the price was maybe 180, 185 a pound. But yeah, Texas was home to about number fifth in number of colonies. So Texas is always around that number three to number five range, ranking only behind North Dakota and South Dakota and California. And the honey production, they ranked third in 2022. So we know this honey production just for the commercial beekeepers is really important. But if we even factor in all the small scale beekeepers across the state, this number could potentially be higher or even the highest among the country. So when you think about, selling honey, you want to think about which category you fall into and what type of product you're planning on selling. Because depending on, I guess, the type of product you're selling, you could fall into one of these different categories. Depending on how much you're selling, you could fall into different categories. Now, I'd say the majority of beekeepers that are in this chat or beekeepers in the program probably fall under either category one or category two, whether you're a honey producer category or whether you're a cottage food operator. Now, if you're selling a lot of honey and you're selling a lot of wholesale honey, not only within the state, but also without this outside the state, you might have to become a licensed food manufacturer, which I don't think a lot of beekeepers in this chat or in this course are part of that situation. But if you are, please let me know because I can provide you some more information about that. Now, really the major difference between a honey producer versus a cottage food operator is, are you selling kind of raw honey? So if you're selling raw honey or creamed honey, you'd fall into the category of a honey producer. But if you're mixing your honey, you're infusing it with like oils, spices, lavender, things like that, you'd have to fall under the cottage food operator. And we'll talk about little differences between the two. But if you're just selling raw honey or even creamed honey, you'd fall under the honey producing category, which is doesn't nearly have as many regulations as some of these other categories. So honey producers, so this is what's defined as sort of a honey producer. These are beekeepers that are selling kind of pure raw honey extracted from their own colony. So if you're, spinning honey, you're extracting the honey, and you're bottling that honey directly from the colony, then you would fall under the kind of honey producer label. So, this honey is typically sold either retail or wholesale by themselves or by anybody associated with that apiary. So let's say, it's you and your family member or some crew that are working with you and you're extracting and bottling that honey, you can fall under this honey producer category. So I'd imagine if you're a beekeeper and you're selling honey at a farmer's market, you're selling it at your local storefront, maybe you're going to some of these other shows or events and selling honey, you'd fall under this honey producer label. Now, who qualifies under a honey producer label? So it's basically a person or individual that sells the honey by themselves. So if you're a beekeeper and you have your own colonies and you're selling your honey, whether wholesale or even online, you can fall under this honey producer. So it's going to be you or maybe an immediate family member, like like a relative, a parent, a cousin, a sibling, things like this would fall under an immediate family member. The honey has to be produced from a hive located in the state of Texas. So, whether you're I guess whether you're on the border, so I mean, let's say you're in Texarkana and you're on the border of Louisiana and Arkansas, but your hives and your bees are physically located in the state of Texas. This would qualify as a honey producer in the state of Texas. So even though your bees may be flying to other states, it doesn't really matter as long as your hive is physically located in the state of Texas. Now, with this honey producer, you can sell your honey retail or wholesale in person. You can sell it via the phone, mail, or even online order. And so you have the capacity to sell your honey in a lot of different ways, as long as it's kind of raw honey directly from your colony, or maybe a family member is helping you manage and take care of your colonies. So you have a lot of flexibility to sell your honey, and a lot of different options of how you want to sell those honey. Reselling honey directly to a third-party consumer is also allowed. And so if you're selling it, for example, to a beekeeper, and that beekeeper is selling their honey or bottling that honey in their storefront, you can also qualify as a honey producer. So, harvest, package, hold, and label honey at the hive location or where your farm activities are held. And so basically what this means is if you're a honey producer, your colonies need to be not only in the state of Texas, but they need to be in your hive location or extract wherever your farm activity is. So let's say you have a out yard, for example, where your bees are actually located, where they're actually making their honey. You can harvest and package honey directly at the apiary, but that never makes sense. Or you can bring it back to wherever your honey house is and kind of harvest, package, and hold the honey there before you sell it either wholesale or online or via the mail. So honey processing, so you're only allowed to sell honey that's pure and raw. And so what that basically means is you're not adding anything to honey, right? You're not infusing it, you're not adding spices, you're not making hot honey, for example. So if you're selling just kind of pure raw honey, this means that you can fall under the honey producer label. Now, I think there's a lot of confusion what pure raw honey is, and so pure just means it's honey directly from the colony. So you're not adding anything directly to that honey. So that's what it means as kind of pure or raw. And it doesn't necessarily mean anything about temperature. It's more, is that honey directly coming from the colony and it's being directly bottled? You may blend or combine honey from your own colonies. And so let's say you have, let's say you have 40 colonies, for example, and you want to extract and bottle the honey. You don't have to kind of blend, you can basically blend that honey together. So if you have honey from different yards, you can extract that all in once, put it into one holding tank, and then bottle it that way. So you're allowed to blend honey from your own colonies. But you're also allowed to blend honey from beekeepers' colonies as long as it's pure and raw honey. So let's say you have a shortage of honey and you want to sell bottled honey, you can mix your honey with some local beekeeper in Texas's honey and still sell that legally under this honey producer label. Now, the part I'm kind of thinking about is, can you buy honey from outside the state? So let's say you're a beekeeper in Texarkana or kind of along the border of Louisiana and Texas. Can you mix your honey with a beekeeper from a different state? I'm not quite sure. I'd imagine it's probably just in state. But that's one thing I might have to look for if that's a situation that you sort of run into. Now, creamed, dried, or dehydrated honey are allowed. And so some beekeepers, like I mentioned, the creamed honey section, they do add a starter, and that allows your honey to crystallize. But I did watch some YouTube videos where they're using kind of a whipping pattern. So like adding air to the honey to crystallize it. That's not allowed under the honey producer label. So as long as you're not adding like dairy, for example, or adding air to your honey, you can sell creamed honey. Now I guess I'm not sure if any beekeepers actually whip their own honey and sell it that way. I'd imagine most have like a starter and then granulate the honey that way. But if you do use a whipping procedure, then that wouldn't fall under the honey producer label, and it might fall more under the cottage food label. Dried dehydrated honey. So some beekeepers have started dehydrating the honey into small crystals that you can kind of package and put into coffee, for example, or put into some sort of hot tea. That is allowed under the honey producing label. So really the biggest takeaway here is as long as it's kind of raw honey directly from the colony, you can make it into cream honey, dehydrate or sell it as kind of raw liquid honey, and that's so allowed under the honey producer label. So freezing, refrigerating, and heating honey to less than 122 degrees is allowed. And so you don't want to try to heat your honey to more than that. So as long as it's less than 122 degrees, which most beekeepers are doing, you should be fine. So what is not allowed is heating your honey to over 122 degrees. So this is where it gets kind of problematic if you want to kill any yeast inside your honey. And so one thing that, I mentioned on the previous session was, one of the best ways to killing yeast in your honey is to heat at 145 degrees for 30 minutes. But if you're doing that, then that would not be allowed under the honey producer label. And so that's why it's really important to control your water content. So instead of heating your honey to an extent where it kills the yeast, you want to make sure your water content is as low as possible so it doesn't lead to fermentation. And so heating is something you might want to consider when marketing your honey under this honey producer label. And like I said, you're not allowed to whip honey in the air. And so if you're whipping your honey and adding air to your honey to make it crystallize, that's now allowed under the honey producer label. It could be allowed under the cottage food label, but not under the honey producer label. But you're also not allowed to add any spices or any fuse your honey. So if you're making hot honey, for example, so adding peppers, for example, or if you're adding lavender or any other types of spices like cinnamon, this isn't allowed under the honey producer label. But what is allowed is you're allowed to sell honey to other entities for resale in locations such as stores, restaurants, retail, or wholesale businesses. So if you're extracting your honey, you're bottling honey. So whether you're combining, honey from all your colonies, or maybe you're buying your neighbor's colonies and mix those together, you're legally allowed to, under this honey producer label, to sell it at stores, restaurants, or even online stores. And so this is definitely really flexible. And so I'd imagine a lot of beekeepers, if you are selling honey, maybe you're selling at farmers markets, maybe you're selling it at a restaurant or a brewery or any type of situation like that. As long as you're not heating up your honey, you're not adding air to your honey, you can legally sell honey under the honey producer label in the state of Texas. So there are certain label requirements under the honey producer label. So one is you need to name the commodity. So, labeling it is a honey, raw honey, pure honey, creamed honey, etc. And so you want to make sure you label exactly what that honey is. So if you're making creamed honey, you want to make sure it clearly says in the label that's creamed honey. If it's raw, unfiltered honey, you want to make sure it clearly says that this is raw, unfiltered honey. If it's this raw honey, you want to put that on the label. So you want to make sure you clearly label what the honey is and how you're selling it. You want to add the name and location of the business or apiary, but if it's not a business, it can be a beekeeper's name. So, Joe's Bees, Joe Loves Bees, for example, you can put that on the label, or you can put your business label like Two Teas Honey, for example. And maybe putting your address could be also very helpful. But you want to make sure you have the name and the location of your business so people can not only find you, but you basically know where that honey is sourced from. I think it's kind of cool to put your apiary location if you want to, just so beekeepers kind of generally know the area. I mean, especially if you're producing honey across state Texas. So if you're producing honey in the Panhandle, in the Gulf Coast, and the east part of Texas, I think it's really useful for a consumer to read the label and know, okay, this is kind of from my region, because a lot of consumers are looking for local honey. So whether that's kind of health benefits such as a pollen for allergies, things like that, you don't want to try to deceive the consumer. So you want to make sure you clearly label where that honey comes from so people are aware of that. Because with this new trend of kind of local honey and local food products, people want to buy more products that are local to your area. So you don't necessarily have to put that if you don't want to, but I think it's really helpful from a consumer's perspective how you label your honey. You want to add the amount of honey, so whether that's metric or standard units, or I mean both metric and standard units. So like how many pounds, grams, things like that on the label. But you also must conform to the Fair Packaging Label Act. So labels are really important, right? You want to make sure your label is kind of clear and inviting to the consumer because you want people to come back and buy your product. So with Honey Producer, right, you're still subject to regulations by the Department of State Health Services in the state of Texas. And so, but beekeepers harvesting raw honey will not be required to license with the DSHS. So if you're on the Honey Producer label, you don't need a specific certification or a license to fall under this umbrella. And so that means that you don't need a license to sell your honey at a restaurant, to a brewery, or even to a farmer's market. But they will investigate complaints. So if there's complaints from another beekeeper or somebody that's buying your honey that it may be adulterated with fructose corn syrup or sucrose, or maybe mislabeled in any way or form. So let's say you label it as raw unfiltered honey when it's actually filtered, and there's some complaints about that. Then the DSHS in the state of Texas will investigate that and will look more into that, and you could get this sort of level revoked from that. So you want to make sure that you're not being deceptive, you're being clear on how you label your honey, and make sure not to adulterate your honey. So not adding anything that's non-honey to the label. Because if you are, you may have to label that honey as, or basically the ingredients as honey and then high fructose corn syrup, for example. So to clearly label what's in the honey. And this is important, for consumers because they really want to know what goes into their bodies and what they consume. And so, some people might have certain allergies, for example. Some people might not be able to consume certain food products. So you want to make sure you're as clear as possible on how you label the honey. But, with the honey producer, for example, if you add sucrose, which I hope, I really hope no beekeepers do, like add and adulterate the honey. This wouldn't fall under the honey producer label. That follow under the cottage food label because this is no longer raw honey. Okay, so the honey producer label is more for beekeepers that are selling kind of raw honey straight from the colony. Can also include, creamed honey and even dehydrated honey. But now we get in the situation of cottage food operators. So let's say you're a beekeeper and you want to infuse your honey, or you want to add spices to your honey, or you want to make hot honey. You want to sell that wholesale or in retail. In these situations, this would fall under the cottage food operator. So under the cottage food operator, these are individuals who sell honey from their own hive that they have purchased. So it's very similar to, it's very, very, very similar to the honey producer label where you have your own colonies or you get honey produced from a different beekeeper. So these are honey that you're kind of closely, purchasing or you're closely producing. But in the cottage food operator, you're legally allowed to add flavoring. You're allowed to add spices, infuse your honey in different ways. And so this allows you to have more flexibility in how you adulterate your honey and add different things to the honey. But it must be packaged and produced in their own kitchen. So if you have a separate honey house, I don't think this would qualify as your own kitchen. But let's say you're extracting honey and you're in your kitchen or your house, and this is something you use in a residential way, then you can still add flavoring and honey under the cottage food law. But your annual gross income can be no more than $50,000. So let's say you're adding honey, you're adulterating the honey with spices, you're adding different flavoring to the honey, you're making hot honey, for example, and your income from that sales are less than $50,000, you're so good under this cottage food operator. But once you kind of reach above that 50,000 marker, then you might have to jump to the next level, which is a licensed food manufacturer in the state of Texas. So this income will be really important. Now, one question I get a lot is, let's say you're selling a mixture of like infused honey. So let's say you have honey that's infused with lavender, and let's say you're also selling kind of raw honey. Now, would this all kind of fall under the cottage food operator? Now, this really depends on your state, but here in the state of Texas, and I might be wrong, so maybe Lynn, correct me if I'm wrong, that you can sell your raw honey under the honey producer label, and then sell your infused honey or your adulterated honey under the cottage food operator. So if you make it more than $50,000, then some of this honey can go under this honey producer label, whereas the rest can go under the cottage food operator. Lynn,
that is correct. You sell raw honey under the beekeeper, and you can sell the infused honey or whatever under the cottage food. So you can sell under both. You don't have to pick one or the other.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. Thanks for the clarification. I was looking into that a little bit last night, and I think I found that Texas was that way, but I think other states that you have to either follow into one label or the other one. So we're fortunate here in Texas that we can do that. So let's say your basically your total gross income is $50,000, but you're selling less than $50,000 under the cottage food operator, then you should still be good. So honey is sold directly to consumers, not in another business within the state of Texas. So you're selling directly to consumers, whether on a storefront or to a restaurant, things like that. Well, Lynn, actually, so with this cottage food operator, can you sell it to a third party? You have to sell it directly to consumers, right?
No, you cannot sell third party. You can't sell to restaurants. You can't sell wholesale. You can only sell directly to the consumer. Now, what the consumer does it, meaning like somebody that bought at a food stand or whatever. I mean, if they want to give it away as gifts or whatever, they can, but you can't sell in the way that you can with the beekeeper honey, where you can do wholesale and to restaurants and storefronts.
Okay, yeah. Thanks for the clarification. Yeah, so you can't sell to a third party. You can sell it directly to a consumer in within the state of Texas.
Yes.
So these are different products, right? Like infused honey. So if you're infusing honey with spices, so like a cinnamon type honey, or if you're infusing it with lavender or any type of product, that would fall under the cottage food operator. If you're making hot honey, which is really great trend, and I'm all here for it. I love me some hot honey. It's really good here in the state of Texas. But if you're mixing it and making hot honey, under cottage food operator. If you're making some jams that have some honey in it, that would also fall under cottage food operator. As long as you're selling it directly to the consumer, and also whether you're making less than $50,000 in gross income. Okay, so oh, okay, so, I don't want to keep doing that. Okay, sorry. Let me go back here quick. Kind of jumped here for some reason. Okay. So who qualifies? Yeah, so I think I talked about that. One thing you must be certified. You must have a food handler certification, unless directly supervised by the cottage food operator. So let's say a situation where maybe it's you and a relative, or you and a friend, and you have this food handler certification, but your friend or your partner, whoever's helping you out, does not have it. They'll be directly supervised by you, and so they can still sell your cottage food product. And so, but you definitely you'll still be required to have a food handler certification or be supervised by somebody that does have that. But yeah, who qualifies? These are people that sell honey themselves or purchase from another apiary source. You're allowed under cottage food operator to, add flavoring and spices to honey, but make sure the annual gross income is less than $50,000. Because if you're making more gross income than that on your cottage food products, then you might have to fall under a licensed manufacturer. And like yeah, kind of Lynn clarified, sell directly to consumers, and you're not allowed to mail or ship your food products. So, unlike if you're under the honey producer label where you can sell third party, or you can sell it to online, for example, you're not allowed to do that under the cottage food operator laws. You must operate and produce from a primary residence containing a kitchen or residential appliances. So this means that you can use your kitchen, for example. So if you're in your kitchen, you're infusing your honey to make hot honey, or you're infusing honey to make lavender honey or cinnamon honey, things like that, you must produce it in your primary residence, in your primary residential appliances. I'll talk a little bit more about the food handler certification. Now this is the one I found. So maybe Lynn got her food handler certification somewhere else, but I know Texas A&M Extension offers a food handler certification program. It's all under Texas A&M AgLearn. So if you go to Google, type in Texas A&M AgLearn, and in the search bar type in food handler certification program, it'll take you right to that course. It takes about 2 hours to complete, probably a little bit quicker. I haven't taken the course yet, but I like to, just to learn more about what's involved with this course. But this QR code will take you directly to that website. But like I said, it's a pretty cheap. It only costs $15, and it'll allow you to get your certification. I'm assuming there's probably other third-party certification systems, but this is just one I know about because I am with A&M Extension. But yeah, like I said, it only takes 2 hours, and maybe some of you have completed this course before and can provide some feedback to other beekeepers. Okay, so what is not allowed? So what is not allowed is selling outside the state of Texas. So if you're infusing honey or making hot honey, you can only sell it directly to consumer in the state of Texas. You're not allowed to sell wholesale to restaurants, stores, or other businesses. And like Lynn mentioned, you can't really control what those businesses are doing, but you're not allowed to directly sell to a third party that's selling it. But you're also not allowed to ship products to customers. So online sales are a no-no. But I mean, let's say you're selling honey at a farmer's market and you're fusing honey, that is allowed under the cottage food operator because you are selling it directly to the consumer. So here are some label requirements. So one thing you need to label is the name of the product. And so you want to make sure like I mentioned beforehand, the label is really important to, share your product to the consumer and allow your consumer to come back and buy your product again. So you want to clearly label on the product what your honey is, whether that's infused or whether it's some sort of hot honey. But the additional words you use cannot be larger than the word honey. So you can use the same font size. So use like lavender infused honey, for example. That all has to be the same font size. But you can't make lavender bigger than the word honey. So you can't have like a huge label of lavender and a small subtext of honey. That's not allowed under Cottage Food Operator. The honey has to be at the same size as additional words or even larger. Name and physical address of the cottage food operation. So what is the name and the address of your business and the location of the food operation system? So in the kitchen, for example, you want to make sure you disclose any food allergens. And so there are some certain food allergens that are required to add to a label. Now, I'd imagine in most situations you want to disclose any food allergens, but depending on how you make your product, you may have to disclose any food allergens. Like, I think soy is new allergen, peanuts, things like that. You have to disclose of any of these allergens. And I think if you go to the FDA, they have a list of food allergens that are required to disclose on a label. And so if you want more information or have any other questions, please let me know. I can help you out and see whether you need a label for that or not. But the one thing you need to add, this is a required statement, according to the Texas Department of State Health Services or local health department. You need to add this food is made in a home kitchen and is not inspected by the Texas Department of State Health Services or local health department. And so because this product is made in the kitchen, you need to make sure you disclose that to any consumers that are buying this product. So they're aware that, this kitchen isn't inspected. This kitchen may not meet the health requirements. You make sure you disclose that on the label. And also, you cannot use a photograph or a depiction of a bee, hive, or comb unless it is pure honey. So, if you're selling lavender infused honey, you can't use photographs of a honeybee or a hive because that can be really deceptive to the consumer. So, I think you can probably use, like, if you're using lavender infused honey, you can probably use like a picture of lavender, for example, but you can have a picture or a hive on your actual label. So this is an entire optional course. Just if you want to learn more about cottage food businesses and what's involved with this. This is also one of our Texas A&M Extension courses. It's not specifically for beekeeping or honey, but kind of gives you a better idea of cottage food businesses and things that you should consider if you do decide to sell infused honey or any honey that's adulterated with spices or infusion. So this course is about $10 on Texas A&M AgLearn. So once again, you go to Texas A&M AgLearn on Google, type in the search bar cottage food business, and then this course should pop up. It's $10. It takes about an hour to complete. So if you do decide to infuse your honey and sell it directly to a consumer, I do recommend taking this course because it can answer really a lot of your questions. Okay, then finally we get into kind of a licensed food manufacturer. So licensed food manufacturer is when you're selling, potentially outside the state. If you're selling kind of infused products, for example, then you may, and you're making more than $50,000 gross income, you'll have to get a licensed food manufacturing license to sell here in the state of Texas. But also if you want to sell wholesale, so let's say in your situation where you want to sell infused honey to a third party, you want to sell infused honey, on mail or to like a restaurant or a bar or a brewery, you'll have to get a licensed food manufacturer because you won't fall under either the honey producer or a cottage food operator. You'll fall under a licensed food manufacturer. So what is a licensed food manufacturer? These are individuals selling and buying honey from their hives. Or they have purchased and inspected or purchased honey from an inspected and approved facility. So, either you can, let's say you're a beekeeper and you have thousands of colonies or even hundreds of colonies and you're buying and selling that honey or even infusing that honey, you can get a licensed food manufacturer, but you can only buy honey from another person that is licensed and basically extracts honey in an inspected and approved facility. So let's say you're a large scale beekeeper, that's your primary business, and you need to buy more honey, but you don't fall under either the honey producer label or the cottage food label. You have to make sure you're buying honey from a beekeeper that has an inspected and approved facility. But for this, you need a Texas manufacturing license is required. But with this, honey may be sold to a third party or resale. So, bees are inspected. You have the food manufacturing license. You can sell, some of the other products wholesale. But also, if you're making more gross income that's higher than $50,000, so you don't fall under the cottage food law, you might be falling under the licensed food manufacturer. Okay, so an entity that manufactures food for public sale must obtain a food manufacturing license from DSHS. So if you have any questions, this QR code might take you to the website and it might provide you more information. So if you are thinking about selling more honey and you don't fall under the honey producer label or the cottage food label, then you might want to look more information about how to become a licensed food manufacturer. But even if another company produces a food, placing your name and address on it necessitates this license. So, let's say you're selling a honey to a third party, they're putting your label on it, for example, you'll still need a license to sell. And applicants must submit a complete application form along with any appropriate fees. Now, if you're wondering, I guess, how much these fees are, it kind of depends on, what's your gross income per year. This QR code takes you directly to that site. So let me scan it quick. Just to give you the exact numbers about how much these licenses cost and how long they last, because it depends on how much profit you're making per year. So if your food sales are less than $10,000, it's $100 for a 2-year license. And if it's amended, $50, yeah. But if you're making, less than 25,000 but more than 10,000, 150. If you're making less than 100,000 but more than 25,000, $250 for a 2-year license. If you're making somewhere between $200,000 in profit and $1 million, it's $900 per license. So, it's not a terrible cost, depending on how much you're producing, and you're probably producing enough to kind of purchase this license. But like I mentioned, these licenses are good for 2 years. If there's an amendment, you do have an additional fee, but it's usually kind of 50% of the price. But yeah, if you want more information, you go to the DSHS, so Texas Department of Safety and Health Services, to provide you more information with the licensing. They also answer any questions you may have if you decide to go into this licensed food manufacturing label. So what is allowed under licensed food manufacturing? So, licensed food manufacturing can provide a wide range of food products, provided they comply with state and federal regulations. So there's different regulations per state, but there's also federal regulations. And honey typically falls under the FDA, not the USDA. USDA is typically more involved with meat type products and meats, whereas the FDA kind of falls under any type of kind of broad food manufacturing. So, my wife works for a food company. She does the kind of food safety and food regulations. And her company produces a wide range of products. And so some of the products that they sell are kind of cured hams and cured meat products. And these products would follow under the USDA, whereas their company also makes hummus. And hummus would follow under the FDA label. So it kind of depends on the product you're making. But in general, honey would follow under the FDA label. So if you have any curiosities or questions about the federal requirements, you typically look into the FDA. They could provide you some more information. But also, if you're like an allergens, for example, so if you're adding anything to the honey and you're not sure if it's an allergen or not, you may want to look at the FDA website to learn more about whether this falls under an allergen and whether you're required by the FDA to label that and disclose that on your label. So in most situations, most things you're adding to honey probably won't have that label on it, but you want to make sure before you sell that, because the worst thing to happen is have some kind of injury or have some kind of health impact from a person consuming your honey because of the allergen and it's not disclosed. But yeah, like I said, the food manufacturing can produce a wide range of food products. That gives you a lot of flexibility. So, if you're selling, infused honey, if you're selling different types of honey-based products and you're making a higher gross income of $50,000, then this allows you more flexibility to sell your honey. But you want to make sure that certain products may have additional requirements or restrictions. So, if your food product is really acidified, and I'm not sure whether you have a situation where it becomes really acidified, so less than a 4 pH, for example, you have additional requirements or restrictions for that. So just be aware that, if you're selling certain food products or infusing your honey in one way or the fashion, and it makes your product really acidic, then you may have certain additional requirements or restrictions for that certain product. And so, if you are infusing honey, I would recommend you can kind of get a pH meter to know what your pH is and making sure that you're not falling under some of these additional requirements you have and restrictions that you have. Okay, inspection. So if you're a licensed food manufacturer, you're subject to basically following the guidelines not only within the state, but also local and federal guidelines. And so you're subject to routine inspections. These inspections can be very, very random, and they basically do an audit of your operation. So your honey extraction facility, your bottling facility, things like that. Now, when I was in North Dakota, I worked for my uncle for quite a few years, and we only had one inspection over those 20 years, so it happens very rarely. With the FDA, they're yeah, I suppose with the FDA, they're pretty busy, so they're not going to worry about a small scale honey producer. I'm not sure how it works for DSHS and how often they do routine inspections, but you never know when they're going to arrive and do an inspection. But oftentimes they do an inspection when they get some sort of complaint or they trace back some kind of health issue back to your specific product. They may do some kind of investigation and look into your facility. So, if you do have a food manufacturing license, I'd be curious to see how often you get a routine inspection by the Department of Safety and Health Services. I can imagine it's very often, but if you do, you want to make sure you're in compliance with the Good Manufacturing Practices or GMPs. And so these GMPs are online, so you're curious about which compliances that you need to follow onto and what type of guidelines you need to have. I would take a look at those good manufacturing practices. So, for example, if you have a licensed food manufacturing facility and you're extracting honey, you want to make sure you have, stainless steel, for example. So you don't want to have rusted out pipes that could transfer lead into your honey. You want to make sure things are kind of following these good manufacturing practices. And so, if you're subject to an inspection and you don't have stainless steel, for example, as your holding tank, that could be a major issue with your product. And I mean, really, just in general, you should be practicing good manufacturing practices in general. Making sure your product is as high quality, flavorful, and the highest quality as possible when you're selling it to a consumer. Now, this is one that's really interesting about the state of Texas is this interstate commerce. You may be wondering, like, let's say you're selling honey outside the state of Texas. So let's say you're in Texarkana and you're going to Arkansas and selling your honey, and you're under this licensed food manufacturing. Are you subject to a different inspection from not only the health services from Texas, but also the FDA or the federal level? But with Texas, since Texas statutes align with the FDA FSMA or Food Safety Modernization Act, then DSHS inspections allow licensed manufacturers to engage in interstate commerce without needing separate federal inspections. So, because the state of Texas and their inspection protocols and their statutes align very close to the FDA, you don't need a separate inspection from not only the state of Texas, but on the federal level for your facility. You're good with just the state of Texas. So here are some additional considerations. So, facility requirements. So manufacturing facilities must meet specific standards. So we're talking about GMPs or good management practices. You must follow these standard protocols and these standard management practices. And this relates to everything from sanitation. So how you clean your holding tank, how you clean your floors, how you clean all your equipment. These all fall under the GMPs. And let's say you're preparing to extract your honey and you're under a licensed food manufacturer and you have a huge holding tank that fits 30 barrels. And how do you clean that? They'll have good management practices on what type of solution and chemical you can legally use to clean that stainless steel holding tank before you actually put honey into it. Or if you're cleaning out your pipes as your honey flows from the spinner into the holding tank, you have to make sure you look at these good management practices, make sure not only you have the right equipment like stainless steel for a certain product or a certain equipment, but make sure it's sanitized in a way that's not going to be unhealthy to the food product. And just in general, I mean, these are kind of common sense rules, right? You should be making sure that you're producing the highest quality as possible, making sure things are sanitized, because you are selling these products to people that are consuming it. And you want to make sure that you're not spreading any things that could cause issues to their human health or even cause death in certain situations. So you want to make sure you're practicing these good management practices as much as possible. Labeling is extremely important, and it must contain all the necessary information. And I talked a lot about this during the honey producer label or the cottage food label. And so making sure you have like the product name on it, making sure that's clearly labeled what the product is, but more importantly, making sure you're disclosing any allergens that you may be putting into the honey. So some allergens, it's required to put on the label with the FDA and with DSHS. So like soy and peanuts, those are things that you clearly have to label on your product. And so you have to make sure that you know what the allergens are and make sure you're not adding those without disclosing that on the label. And then good record keeping is going to be really important. So, if you are subject to random periodic inspections from the DSHS, and so you want to make sure you have really detailed records of your entire facility, your good management practices, like when you're sanitizing, for example, like you know exactly when you're sanitizing and what you're sanitizing with and how much you're using, right? You're disclosing how many supers you're pulling into your hot room and you're pushing through the system. You're disclosing, how you clean your floors. You're basically trying to make sure you have the best records as possible because, when somebody does come for an inspection, they really expect you to have all these records available and in place for them during their inspection. Because if you don't, like I said, either you can get written up or you can get your license revoked. So you want to make sure you keep record keeping as much as possible. But really, the most important part of record keeping is for traceability. And so I know a lot of the commercial beekeepers, they keep a sample of honey from each barrel that they bottle. So, let's say, Quaker, for example, buys some honey for their product. They want to make sure, and that causes health issues. They want to trace back what caused the health issues so they can alert anybody else that may have bought that product and maybe pull those products from the shelf. And so it's really important to know where your honey comes from and be able to trace that back to every single barrel or every single 5-gallon pail that you're selling. So regulations, so really whether you're a honey producer, whether you fall under cottage food law, or whether you fall under a licensed manufacturer, say in Texas, you're subject to regulations not only at the federal level, at the state level, but even the local, even your HOA. So you have to be really aware of all these different regulations. Now, what's really great about the FDA and DSHS is they really align very closely to each other. So what that means is if you're selling across state lines to different states and you're inspected and you follow the guidelines of the DSHS here in Texas, you're fine to sell that honey across state Tex without getting separate inspection by the FDA. But it would be good for you, if you're following on this label, to look at the FDA, look at their guidelines, and see how closely they do align with Texas, because there may be some things that the FDA require that Texas does not, and you have to make sure you clearly label that or make sure that you follow those guidelines. But also the FDA has some really great guidelines, like general management practices or best management practices, sanitation practices, things like that. So the FDA is a really great resource for finding some of that information. But just know that FDA regulates all these different food products, right? They regulate everything from peanut butter to hummus to ketchup to condiments, things like that. And so they're making these practices as general as possible. So you want to make sure that you're kind of developing your own system and make sure you're following protocols and make sure your product is as healthy and safe as possible to whoever's consuming and purchasing that honey. Yeah, so for the local and HOA level, you might want to look at your HOA. You might look at your local city or municipality and see whether they have certain restrictions on whether or not you can produce, sell honey in your kitchen, for example. So if you're selling a product that's under cottage food law and you're fusing that honey with lavender, for example, your HOA may not allow that. And so you may have to look at your HOA regulations or even local regulations to see whether that's legal or not in your specific area. And I'm not sure. I've looked at all these different cities and municipalities. And so if you had any issues on the local HOA level, please let me know, because I'm curious if, certain cities or municipalities have certain regulations that prohibit you from producing food in your residential kitchen. So this is sort of an optional label you can add. And so this was I think it was required at some point, but now it's entirely optional label. But There was this botulism, which caused a lot of kind of fetal deaths or infants under age of 1 when they consumed honey. And so this botulism, it's really rare, but it's caused by Clostridium botulinum bacteria. And so this botulinum bacteria can be found in honey, and when infants below the age of 1 consume honey, that can cause, muscle paralysis, they can cause difficulty breathing, blurred vision, and even death if untreated. Now, we'll say this is extremely rare, but if you do have a child, for example, you have a grandchild or you're interacting with a kid under 1, never give them honey because there is a risk, even though it may be rare, for them to develop botulism and eventually have some, not only short-term issues, but even long-term issues, even potentially leading to death. And so, you could label do not feed to infants under 1 year. I think just generally a lot of people don't know that you can't feed honey to, kids or infants under the age of 1. And so I think it's always just good practice in general to label that you should not feed this honey to infants under 1, just because you really don't want to assume that everybody knows this. I guess my wife, she's a food scientist. She does food safety regulations, and so I get in flux with all this information all the time. And so I'm very well aware of all these regulations, including the botulism with honey, but just a general consumer may not be aware of some of these issues. So I would, add this label just to be sure that everybody that consumes honey knows that you cannot feed this to infants. I found this on the honey labeling. I like to make my own for Texas, but this is from South Africa, and they in South Africa, they have their own honey labeling laws, and they made this this kind of quick fact sheet on how you label your honey. Now in South Africa, they have different regulations, and really each country has their own regulations. I mean, some countries have regulations, but they have specific things you need to add to your label. So, I talked about the different requirements for labeling for cottage food law and honey producers. So you want to make sure you follow those labels clearly and have everything on the label. But here in South Africa, they make sure to add the honey label. If you do infused honey, for example, the honey has to be at the same size or bigger than any additional words. So if you do lavender infused honey, the honey has to be the same size or bigger than any additional words. You want to make sure you add kind of the product type. So if you do kind of raw honey, you do raw and filtered honey, you can do creamed honey, things like that. Here they add in South Africa, they have non-irradiated or radiated. That basically means, is it local or is it coming from a different country? Because if it's irradiated, that means this honey is being purchased or infused from honey from a different country. And so in that situation, especially here in South Africa, you have to put the country of origin. So if you're mixing honey from South Africa and another country, maybe Madagascar, you need to put both South Africa and Madagascar on this label. They also require you to have storage numbers, but also like a lot ID and a data package, just so people can trace back the honey product in case there is some kind of health issue. So it kind of depends on what type of level or type that you're falling under, a honey producer or cottage food manufacturer. But you want to make sure that your honey is labeled to the right specifications. Okay, I'm talking about kind of U.S. Honey grading. So, if you go to the honey source, for example, you may see this label here. It says U.S. grade A or U.S. grade B honey. And you're probably wondering, like, what does that mean? This is a voluntary service. And it's not required by law to sell honey that is graded in the state or in the United States. So this is an entirely voluntary service. But just remember that if you're a licensed food manufacturer and you're selling honey to, Brookshire's or HEB, for example, they may require you to get a grade on your honey so they can have that on their stores. So it kind of depends on the third party you're actually selling it to. One thing you should look for is the product of it in which country of origin. Sometimes there can be mislabeling, which is a big issue, which I talk about next. But basically, these grades range from a C all the way to an A, and these grades are based on really 4 major categories: is the clarity of the honey, the flavor of the honey, the moisture content, and the color. And so most small beekeepers, and so if you're a small scale beekeeper, you sell honey, you typically sell them without a USDA grade. But like I said, some buyers like grocery stores like HEB and Brookshire's, they may require a USDA grade label to sell their product on their shelves. So what falls under a grade A, B, and C under this voluntary grading system? So a grade A has to reach a minimum of a 90 point or above to 100. So these grades are based from 0 all the way to 100. A B has a minimum score of 80 points, and a C has a minimum score of at least 70 points to 80 points. So, what you're looking for is a grade A, which has the highest quality, the highest flavor profile, and really is the most desirable type of honey, which falls in this 90-point category. It's grade A. Now, there's a lot of issues with this grading protocol, which I'll talk about a little bit more. And you may see some honeys on the stores, and you're like, well, how the heck is this a grade A? These grading systems haven't changed for, I think they're developed by 40, 50 years ago, and they haven't changed 1 ounce that I can find. I think they're basically the same grading system. I think they should be modified, but this is kind of the system we have right now. So when you submit honey, there's sort of a ranking system, and you basically put a score next to honey from a scale of 0 to 100. And like I said, with a grade A, you want a score of 90 points or higher. A grade B would be 80 to a 90, and then a C would be 70 to an 80. So your goal is to try to get this grade A honey because that's going to be more desirable, not only if you're selling a third party, but also for a consumer. Now, what they do is they basically rank the flavor, and they become a point scale from 45 to 50, 40 to 44, and 35 to 39. It's very subjective, as you can imagine. Some darker honey tastes different from, lighter honey, for example. So how do they grade that? But there are some situations I'll get next time. So you can have grade A amber or grade A kind of white or grade A dark amber. And so you can have certain grades for specific types and colors of honey. And so that's one way they kind of rank the flavor, even though honey comes in a lot of different varieties and flavors. They look at defects. And so I would say the majority of honey that's being sold automatically gets a 40 points here. And so as long as it's filtered and, if it's heated, for example, to remove any of the debris or particles within the honey. And so typically most of the honey that's being sold or graded will have defects and they'll automatically get those 40 points. So they're already halfway there to get that graded scale. And even if their flavor is maybe a 40, for example, they're already at that grade A scale. I think, yeah. So basically clarity too. So if you filter your honey a certain way and heat up a certain way, you're automatically getting 10 points for clarity. So most honey that's submitted are automatically getting these 50 points. It kind of depends on the flavor. And flavor, as you as a beekeeper know, is very, very subjective. So I don't think it's the greatest grading scale. It is optional, so it's not required, but I think we can have a better grading scale, maybe here in Texas. There also be grading scales based on basically the color of the honey. So you have grade A water white, grade A extra white, white, all the way to dark amber. So you can get specific grades, but you also grade them based on basically the color of the honey. So they're basically ranking these from water white all the way to dark amber based on the color of the honey. So recently, there's a Hive Act that was introduced, I believe in the House, the House, yeah, recently. And this new Hive Act, which was kind of pushed forward by the national organizations, both the American Beekeeping Federation and the American Honey Producers, they're pushing this act called the Hive Act. They tried a couple years ago and put this into the Farm Bill, but that didn't happen. But they did find some new sponsors, as they're really, I mean, a lot of beekeepers are trying to push to get this Hive Act enacted. And so this is going to be where what this means. So it would mandate the FDA to define a standard or identity for honey based on U.S. And so what is U.S. honey basically? And what is the standard that we must use to grade this honey as U.S. honey or not? And so that's going to be kind of the development of that stage. So are we going to use a mass spec to look if honey's adulterated? Are we going to look at the pollen grains in the honey? Basically trying to define what is the standard of identity of honey in U.S. Country of origin labels. So like South Africa, I mentioned beforehand, it's required in South Africa to put South Africa on the label or where that honey comes from. And so country of origin label will be required here with this act. And they'll direct the FDA to report to Congress any actions taken against adulteration or misbranded honey. So FDA will have more regulations on honey and allow them to look more into adulterated honey or honey that's been impacted. Okay, so I want to kind of briefly touch about honey varietals. So, I've only been in Texas for about 9 months, and I've tried maybe half of these, but I'd love to try all these different honey varietals. But what's really great about Texas is, it's a really diverse area. Bees are collecting honey from a lot of different sources, and based on the nectar and the pollen they're bringing in, that directly impacts the flavor profile, the color, and the type of honey that's being produced. So these are kind of common honey varietals that are sold here in Texas. So we have Texas tallow, which is found in the Texas Gulf Coast. Tallow is an invasive weed, and so the government is trying to push the tallow out and try to push it out. But it's a really great food product for beekeepers, especially on the Gulf Coast. Orange blossom, it's not as much as it used to be, as I've read, but there are some orange blossoms that are still growing in the lower Rio Grande Valley of Texas, but a lot of orange blossoms are produced in other parts of the country. Mesquite honey from the deserts of southwest of the United States, Wahia, Uvalde County. And then we have some kind of more general honeys that can be found not only in Texas but across the United States. But I would say in general, like tallow, mesquite, Wahia. These are things that are typically only found in Texas or near Texas. But clover, wildflower honey, which is a general honey, buckwheat, these are things that can be found in the Midwest and the southern United States. Yaupon, I never had this before. I'd like to try sometime, but it's found in the Post Oak Savannah region of Texas. But here in Texas, we have a lot of cotton also and vetch. And so just so yeah, each honey is a little different. They have different types of sugars in the honey, different flavor profile, things like that. So this is what a Yaupon holly. This is what kind of read on kind of Walker Honey Farms. They kind of wrote a profile on it because I know they sell a little bit of it. I know they don't produce a lot of it, but I'd love to buy some and try it out because I've never tried it before. But yeah, what they state is Yaupon honey is less sweet than most honeys and has a little bit of bitterness to it. So I typically compare all my honey to kind of a sweet clover honey. That's kind of my standard, and then compare the bitterness based on that. And so according to this, it's a bit more bitter than other types of honey. It's produced from nectar of this Yaupon holly. It's a plant that's native to Texas, so maybe you have some of these in your yard, and apparently produce a really great honey. But it's typically kind of an amber or light amber color with smooth texture that's not as thick. And so if you go back to this label, so it'd be kind of this darker color right here, so not like a water white or extra white honey. It's gonna be kind of this extra light amber to amber type color. Tallow, so tallow has a slight bitterness that balances the natural sweetness and increases of a complex, robust flavor. This is also with Walker Honey Farms. I've tried tallow before, and I really like it. It's a little bitter, so I personally like a honey that's a little bitter, so it's sweet but has a little bitterness to it. I do like that flavor profile, and so I do like tallow. I know some beekeepers like it, some beekeepers don't. So it kind of depends on your preference, but I would try it at least once to see how you like it. It's produced from this tallow tree, which is not native to Texas, but it's a major honey flow, especially in the Gulf Coast region of Texas, and beekeepers produce a large amount of honey from tallow. Wahia, this is another honey I've never had before, but it's one that's unique to Texas. This is also from Walker Honey Farm. They say that, Wahia honey is known for its sweet, smoky flavor with subtle hints of cinnamon and peach. So I've never had before, but I mean, some of you probably have, and it has a little smoky flavor to it, huh? That sounds really, really interesting, especially if you mix that with the cinnamon and peach flavor to it. Kind of a beautiful white honey, so not as dark as the Yaupon honey, but a little bit cloudier, probably gives it sort of that smokier flavor. And it's produced from the Wahia plant, a shrub native to Texas. So you find this mostly in the southern part of Texas. Mesquite. Mesquite is another one I haven't tried, another varietal here in Texas. Has a slightly floral and pleasantly mild, offering a gentle sweetness with smooth, subtle taste. So this is another description from Walker Honey Farm. It's the lightest honey, both flavor and color among all the varieties. It's a really light honey, apparently. And it's produced from nectar of mesquite trees which thrive in arid regions of Texas. So this is definitely another honey I would like to try and compare to other honeys I've had in the past. Okay, honey standards. This photo didn't turn out too well, but some countries, especially Manuka honey in New Zealand and Australia, have certain standards that can be used to market your product as a specific type of honey. So what they typically so New Zealand and Australia, they use different types of factors. UMF is this one type of factor they use to rank the Manuka factor, but the Manuka factor is great to use in this UMF scale. which measures the concentration of these three components, which have been tested and found to have these antimicrobial and antimicrobial properties and even medicinal properties. And so what they're looking for is this methylglyoxal, dihydroxyacetone, and then leptospirin. And so these are really important compounds that have been shown to have medicinal factors. So what they do is they measure the concentration of these three compounds, and they develop that into a UMF score. So this one had a UMF of 10 plus, but I've seen some that are higher than that, I think like 50 plus or so. Some use just an MGO scale, so the amount of methylglyoxal. And so if it has more methylglyoxal, it gets a higher MGO scale. And so it kind of depends on the ranking system they use. But I found UMF is a pretty common scale, but MGO is also pretty common. But New Zealand government enforces strict guidelines because this is a really desirable honey. It's shown to have a lot of medicinal properties, and so they want to make sure that people aren't selling that honey if it's truly not the quality that needs to be. And so it allows them to kind of strictly enforce the type of honey that's being sold and make sure it's as high quality as possible. And so, maybe the Texas could do something similar to this for some of our unique honeys like Wahia, or maybe tallow honey, for example, things that beekeepers produce a lot of, and maybe it has some of these key compounds that have medicinal properties. And so I know Dr. Ozturk at the UT San Antonio is doing a lot of great work trying to find these compounds. And, eventually once he identifies the compounds, we can develop our own Texas-like scale for our products. Okay, so next week we'll finally get into queen rearing and queen breeding. And so yeah, we'll meet next Tuesday from 9 to 12, and we'll talk everything about queens and breeding. But with that, I will take any questions if there are any.
Yes, Dr. Slater, Doug. Oh,
Yeah, Doug, you can go.
Yeah, I noticed a lot of articles lately about certain places stopping honey judging because of the problematic adulterations of honeys. Can you explain a little bit what these people are adulterating their honeys with?
Yeah, so this is more in Europe. I'm not sure if it's impacted us in the United States. Maybe there's some that have changed, but I know in Europe they've had a few honey shows, and this honey is being adulterated with other additives like sugar. And so when you add sugar, for example, that increases the flavor profile. Depending on the sugars you add to it, that can change the sweetness and the flavor of the honey and change the honey altogether. But you really, for a lot of these honey shows, they want to make sure that's pure and raw from the colony before it's judged. And so, this is one problem that we're seeing a lot of where, honey that's being bought from overseas or other countries being adulterated with high fructose corn syrup. And as you can imagine, it makes honey cheaper. It allows you to sell the honey at a cheaper price because maybe you're cutting that honey in half and adding it with other sugars. And so that's one problem that we're dealing with. And as you can imagine, it's really tough to test. It's really tough to test for adulteration. So if you add a sugar to a sugar, which is what honey is, it's really hard to tell apart what's being added to the honey. So it's a really difficult problem. And really the best approach to test for it is by measuring the pollen in the honey, which is time consuming and we don't have labs available for that. VK, you had a question?
Yeah, Dr. Slater. So when I'm extracting honey from the centrifuge honey extractor, after the spin, after collection, I usually collect the honey in a bucket and then package it in mason jars. But before, from the extractor to the bucket, I use a double sieve, to filter out any larger chunks of wax and whatnot. But can I still call this honey filtered, or is it? Can I still call this unfiltered, or is it filtered because I'm using the double sieve?
That's a good question. I mean, yeah, so when people say filtered, right, they're filtering it to a certain size, and there's really no regulations on how you market it as filtered or not. Like I go to the store, for example, and you say it's like raw unfiltered honey, but it's obviously been filtered, and so maybe there's a certain mesh that they use to market as filtered or not, and maybe somebody else can kind of touch on that a little bit because I'm not sure, like how would you mark that as filtered when it's obviously filtered? And it probably depends on the mesh you're using. Yeah, so if somebody has any comments on that, I'd love to hear more about that. But you can probably just put raw honey on your label. honestly, unless you want to put raw and filtered for some reason. You probably just kind of raw honey on your label,
Okay,
as long as you're not, heating it up to that certain temperature.
got it. Thanks.
So Ski had a question. So you mentioned stainless steel holding tanks are required to pass inspections. Will plastic holding tanks pass inspections? Yeah, so I mean, depends on how much you're selling, but if you're selling, if you're a licensed manufacturer, for example, and you have all plastic holding tanks, this probably won't pass inspections. It's not like they will revoke your license, but they want to make sure you're using kind of stainless steel for your large holding tanks. But if you're a small scale beekeeper and you're under cottage food law or a honey producer, then you should be good with just plastic. So C said, is there a current bill introduced that is similar to the Hive Act? I'm not too I've looked too much into this HR 4764. I'm not sure exactly. I think it's a little different. It kind of goes more to the small scale beekeepers. I think they want to add some labeling, but I'm not quite sure exactly what the language of this is. I think there's some work involved with it, but once I get an update about it, because I think it's probably go up here pretty shortly. I'll let you guys know. Okay, so Shane is saying you're going to share two links from the Texas Beekeeper Association. Yeah, so TBA also has some information on cottage food operators versus honey producer. So okay, so Lawrence or Larry said, is there a limit on how long you can leave honey in your heated tank at 105? There's not like a regulation, but if you leave in the tank at 105 for too long, that can lead to some issues. Now 105 in general is pretty good, but I wouldn't leave at 105 once your temperature or your moisture content gets low enough. So if you're just heating up to lower your moisture content, and once you reach 16%, there's really no reason to heat it any longer. This doesn't cause more issue with your honey because even though you're not heating up to 145 or 160, which is the temperature that can be used to degrade enzymes over time, if you're heating for a longer period of time, that degrade it. So I'd say at 105, if your honey has a really high water content, I would just check it periodically, maybe every 4 hours to see whenever your water content gets lower into a level that you're comfortable with. That's what's really important to have a refractometer to make sure you measure that and make sure that it's at a label or a level that you're comfortable with. Yeah, so Ness said, I believe that honey is generally considered unfiltered if it's not strained to less than 1 micron. Yeah, that was kind of my impression, right? Because unfiltered would be like you're not filtering all the pollen. Yeah. So most pollen grains fall into 25 to 150 micron size. Yeah. Yeah, so yeah, it might be 1 micron. I'm not sure there's like clear regulations behind whether you call it filter unfiltered. It's kind of up to your preference. But yeah, one micron might be the size you want to look for VK if you want to add unfiltered.
Thanks, Dr. Sid.
And Doug, is feeding bees with high fructose corn syrup or sugar syrup too close to extraction adulterating? Yeah, it could be, right? So if you have honey supers on and you're feeding really heavily with high fructose corn syrup, blend, or even sucrose, the bees can store that where the honey is. And so that, I mean, I guess I wouldn't call that adulterating, but it can be a form of adulteration, right? Because you're messing with the honey and changing the honey profile. So, if you have honey supers on, there's really no reason to feed bees close to extraction. I would wait until all the honey supers are pulled before you really start feeding. Okay, perfect. Well, I think that's all the questions. If anything else, oh, Ski had one more. So Ski said I had a question on QR codes. Are they okay on the label for contact info? I don't think there's any issue with adding QR codes. Just kind of looking at the regulations that we developed, I don't see any issue with adding any QR codes. Yeah. I mean, with cottage food law kind of outlined, like you have pictures of bees, but I think a QR code is totally fine. And
Hey, Garrett,
yeah,
sorry.
yeah.
I think he's asking instead of, which I know some beekeepers kind of do this, where they put their website instead of their apiary location and phone number and everything. I think that's what he's asking is instead of putting the phone number and all that on there, if he had a QR code to a website that has that contact information, is that okay?
I wouldn't think so. Yeah, because it's not clearly on the label. So like some things can be on a QR code, right? Like your API location and contact information. But I think for some of these, let me go back. I think you clearly have to have on the label the location and your address. So you can have a QR code, which is great, but you also have to have it on the label so people can easily find it. Okay, perfect. Well, I think that's the last question. And so, yeah, I'll send more information next week about the queen rearing and queen breeding. I pretty much have this one done. So this one I was kind of working on a little bit more. So I'll send you the information for this session. But next week I have all the PowerPoints already for queen rearing, queen breeding. So I'll send that all to you probably early tomorrow once we get all the videos uploaded. So but yeah, thank you guys all for joining. Hope you guys enjoyed it. I know it was a lot about laws and regulations, but see you guys all next week.